Our first topic tonight is sexual citizenship. Now, some of you, I'm going to guess, might not have heard this term before. And the only reason I'm guessing that is because when this topic was suggested, I had never heard this term before. This topic was suggested by Allison Moon, and I've done a little bit of research to try to understand this concept of sexual citizenship. From my basic understanding, it encompasses the idea of how sexuality applies to political and cultural existence in society. I even saw one article that was talking about how when we talk about, like, a person, imagine a person in our culture, there's a tendency most people will have to picture a straight white male. And a straight white cisgendered male, I should say. And the concept of sexual citizenships asks us to challenge that mindset and create and broaden our language and thinking to create a less centralized personhood and really consider all people. So that's my basic understanding. I might be completely off base, and we'll find out where I am. So I'm going to bring everybody into the conversation now. We have Nicole, Camille, Reba, Allison, and Lee. And Allison, if you don't mind, I'd love to start with you. Based on your understanding, how was that for a primer on sexual citizenship?
I thought it was a great introductory definition. I think that the way I consider sexual citizenship, to make it a little bit more personal, is that it's the way that any individual explores, pursues, and has sex influences every other aspect of our lives. It influences how we show up in community and how we show up in society. There is this tendency in our culture, specifically American culture, to separate and to isolate sexuality from everything else and to treat it like this black box that we only open when we're in bed with a specific person at a specific time. And sexual citizenship asks us to kind of open that box and acknowledge that sex is part of our lives. It's part of how we move through the world. It's part of how we are neighbors. It's part of how we are parents. It's part of how we are citizens. And that we need to be more aware of that, because that affects how our relationships, even platonic ones, form and how we show up in the world on a regular basis.
That definitely broadens my understanding. It almost feels like, I remember thinking this when I heard the topic, that it almost sounds like this idea of the environment and how we treat ourselves, like environmentally, globally, as, there's the environment and then what we can do about it, as opposed to considering ourselves as part of the environment, the ecosystem. Right. And it feels like this is sort of the sexual lens through which to see that kind of perspective. Is that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the ecological angle is a really good one. We are not separate from the world, looking down on it like we're scientists examining something through a microscope. We are of it. And we need to get out of this idea that we are stewards rather that we are part of it. And same thing with sexuality. Even if you are asexual, that there is your lack of sexual interest or sexual desire is still a part of you and how you show up in the world. And I think the analogy you had mentioned about this notion of true neutral, of a cis, white, heterosexual man as the neutral human being in our minds, and then everybody else being marked, is a really great way for us to perceive that too, that everyone who doesn't have sex like that imaginary man has is somehow always bringing sex into their lives. This notion that, LGBT rights are always like, they're always shoving their sexuality in people's faces. It's like, no, we're just acknowledging that our sexuality is part of how we show up in the world, and that straight people have been able to have the privilege to invisibilize that part of themselves. And rather than that privilege, we want to acknowledge that everyone's sexuality is a part of who they are in the world, period.
And with what you're talking about there, I think there's also the issue of, you bring up the notion of privilege. If you are someone who is, say, if we look at classist issues, right, class issues, if you're somebody who is working 3 jobs to be able to afford to live, where is the space for sexuality in your life? Where is the space for that piece of your authentic self? And so the perception that, oh, if you don't have a sex life, it's because your libido is low, or it's because, no, you're not having a relationship right now. Well, it's also at play with a wide variety of other cultural issues and other points of oppression in this world.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's intersectionality at work. I mean, intersectionality is such a big word and so many people are so afraid of it, but it really just means examining how these things interact and contrast and amplify other aspects of our lives. And, the way that we see motherhood is very different for white middle-class women than it is for, indigenous lesbians. It's very different. And we have to acknowledge that, being a mother, being a lesbian, being a woman, being whatever, they're not all the one thing. There's no one way to be a woman. There's no one way to be a sexual person. And acknowledging that diversity and acknowledging that those issues are intricately related to everything in our lives, the politics, the class, the race, the religion, all of these things are all part of the same whole. And sex is not something that you can just kind of add in at will or erase at will. It's always there with us, just like any other aspect of our identity is.